Rudeus is reuniting with Paul and Millis in the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation anime series was easily the most emotional point of the series, no doubt. There's just so much connection to be had there with a father being reunited with their son and, yes, getting over their problems, realizing the more important things in life. But yes, as one would expect, a lot of the novel series context was skipped in the anime adaptation. Really, a huge chunk of Volume 5 is just missing, or it's just kind of adapted into a montage in the OP itself. So that's what we're going to get into with this particular Mushoku Tensei skipped content video. The deeper story behind Paul, the displacement incident, and his fall into a very depressed state, all culminating to the point where he has that realization of what is important and that, yes, Rudeus, at least in his eyes, is a child. As per usual, this video is going to be only covering stuff that was skipped by the anime adaptation, so don't worry about anything beyond the anime so far. This is just strictly skipped content. With all that said, let's just jump right into it, because it's probably going to be a long one, and hopefully I don't get emotional. We first start things out with Paul's side of the story after the displacement incident in Chapter 2 of Volume 5. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in the middle of a grassy plain. It was an unremarkable stretch of flat, empty land, but oddly enough, it felt familiar. I tried to determine where I was, and the answer came to mind before too long. It was in the south of the kingdom of Asura, near a town where I spent some time in. It was a place I stayed back when I was learning the water god style, and Lilia's hometown. Naturally, I concluded that it had to be some sort of dream. I had no reason to be here after all. Still, it sure brought back memories. How many years had I spent in this area? 1? Maybe 2? All I knew for sure was that I hadn't stayed too long. Most of my memories from that period of time in my life concerned the training hall and the senior students I trained with there. They were a pack of arrogant idiots with big mouths and no real skill. I had actual talent, so they were always busy trying to keep me in my proper place. I'd always hated being bossed around like that. The whole reason I ran away from home in the first place was to get out from under my old man's thumb after all. But he had been a genuinely competent and intimidating man, with enough power to justify his ego. The senior students, on the other hand, were just useless trash, with swollen heads. By the time I reached intermediate rank, they were still lagging in the late stages of their beginner lessons. It was honestly kind of pathetic. Hell, even the master of the training hall had only reached the advanced rank in the water god style. He's one of those old coots who loves shout about guts and determination, despite the fact that never got him much anywhere. I wanted to show every last one of them just how good I really was someday. Never really got the chance, as it turned out. I eventually lost my patience with their bull. Forced myself on Lilia out of petty spite and ran away in the night. I'd been looking to get with her for a while, but in that moment, all I wanted was to make a mess of everything they had treasured. By the next morning, they were all out searching furiously for me. I fled to a foreign country with a sneer on my face. God, I really was a stupid little I didn't care about how much the students hated me, but taking my frustration out on Lilia like that wasn't exactly my finest hour. The wind was picking up. A bit of dust blew in my eye, and I grimaced slightly. A moment later, there was a small tug at my sleeve. Daddy, where are we? For some reason, I was holding Norn in my arms. She was looking up at me with anxiety in her eyes. At this point, I finally realized I was actually standing in the middle of a field in the clothes I wore at home. I could feel solid ground under my feet and the warmth of my daughter's body against my chest. This wasn't a dream. What the heck? I didn't have a first idea what I was doing here. If I had been alone, I probably would have gone on believing that it was a dream. But Norn was right here in my arms. Yeah, that was little Norn, all right. My adorable 3-year-old daughter. I didn't hug her like this very often. I was going for a more stern, dignified father thing. So I mostly kept physical expression of affection to a minimum. What was she doing in my arms then? Oh, right. Now I remember. Just a few moments ago, I've been chatting with Zenith in our house. You know, girls stop letting their fathers hug them once they grow up a little. You really should get a few squeezes in while you can. Nah, I'm working on my paternal dignity this time around. Compared to Rudeus, Norn seems more like an ordinary kid, right? If I play my cards right, I bet I can convince her that I'm the greatest man in the world. Wasn't that your father's approach too? I thought you hated him. You got a point there. All right, then let me at her. It was a silly, casual conversation. Lilia was nearby as well, teaching Aisha something or another. After realizing that girl was gifted, she decided to nurture her talents through constant lessons and lectures. I argued that Aisha would be a lot more happier if we let her have a more carefree childhood, but Lilia pushed back so ferociously that I had to back down. The kid was really growing up fast though. She started walking at a very early age and absorbed everything we taught her like a sponge. Lilia was a good teacher, so that was probably a good part of it. But Aisha was making so much progress that it made me worry that there might be something wrong with Norn. When I brought that up to Lilia, she told me, Aisha's nothing special compared to young Master Rudeus, and Miss Norn's a perfectly normal kid. I didn't really care if Norn was normal or not, honestly, but when I pictured her growing up in the shadow of 2 brilliant siblings, it made me feel a little bad for her. I remember thoughts like those running through my mind, and then I was suddenly enveloped in a blinding white light. Yeah, I remember now. It wasn't some sort of gap in my memory. The fact that I still had Norn in my arms was proof of that. The girl had been walking around on her own for some time now, but I was holding her to my chest. Something very strange was going on. That much was immediately obvious. Daddy? Norn spoke to me again in an uneasy voice. She had been watching my face this whole time. It's all right, Norn. Gently patting her on the head, I looked around the area. Zenith and Lilia were nowhere to be seen. Were they somewhere close nearby? Or was I the only one that was brought here? In that case, why was Norn still with me? One possibility came to mind. I once triggered a very nasty trap in the depths of a labyrinth, a hidden teleportation circle, and this felt very similar. At the time, I was lucky enough to be teleported close nearby, but I reflectively grabbed Il and Elise by the sleeve as the trap went off, which got her dragged into it as well. She was pretty pissed off at me. If you're unlucky, a teleportation trap of that sort of thing can be instantly lethal. It wasn't really my fault that I stepped on it, since our monkey of a scout should have spotted the thing beforehand. But that wasn't important right now. Basically, teleportation magic was capable of instantly moving both you and anyone you were in physical contact with to a different location. That would explain why Norn was still with me. But the others weren't. Why had I been teleported though? There was no warning at all. Had someone done this to me deliberately? To be honest, I did have enemies all over the place. It wouldn't be surprising if someone launched a sneak attack on me, given all the bad stuff I'd done in the past. But teleportation magic? That didn't make sense. For one thing, there was no known incantation for it. To teleport someone, you need to either use a magic circle or a special magic item. Teleportation items were banned worldwide, and the creation of teleportation circles had been forbidden for so long that the art itself was all but lost. Why would anyone go to such extreme, dangerous lengths just to take revenge on a single man like me? Why would they just dump me in the middle of an empty field? Could one of the students from the training hall have been responsible? Maybe they were still holding a grudge and teleported me away so they could get their hands on Lilia. Maybe they put me here to send a message. And when I made my way back to the house, I'd find Zenith and Lilia had been despoiled by a gang of vicious thugs. Damn. That did sound like something those bastards would think of. Daddy? Don't worry, Norn. It's okay. We'll get back home soon enough. Trying to reassure myself, as much as Norn, I set off to a nearby town. Fortunately, I had Osrin gold coin hidden away in my sword sheath for emergencies. And thanks to the old habits of my adventuring days, I also kept my sword on my person, even when I slept. The only time I took it off was when I made love. My adventurer card was tucked away inside the holder too. Just a small precaution against exactly this sort of emergency. I made my way to the local guild and exchanged a gold coin for smaller denominations. The receptionist handed me back 9 Osrin silver coins and 8 large copper. They apparently hiked their fees up at some point, but I had more than I needed anyways. I quickly reviewed the tasks that were available, found one for emergency delivery, and accepted it on the spot. My card ran out of magical energy years ago, so the lady behind the counter had to recharge it for me first. When the words on it reappeared, she exclaimed in surprise and asked me why an S-rank adventurer was taking a job like this. Since it was an emergency request, the normal restrictions didn't apply, but under normal circumstances, it would have been an E-rank task. I didn't have any real reason to hide my situation, but I didn't feel like taking time to explain. I fed her some vague non-explanation, then asked if I could borrow a horse. This is one of the special perks the guild offered S-rank adventurers. When you accepted an urgent delivery job, they loaned you a free ride. Of course, you need to get back the horse once the job was done, but this time, I was planning on riding off in a totally different direction. I did feel bad for the client, but I had an emergency of my own to deal with. The horse they brought out turned out to be a quite impressive specimen. I got unlucky. The delivery job must have been very urgent indeed. There was a real possibility I'd lose my status as adventurer for this stunt, but I could live with that. I wasn't planning on making a living that way ever again. I hoisted Norn on the horse and hopped on behind her. We galloped out of town immediately. Halfway through the trip, Norn fell ill. The girl had no experience riding horseback, and I kept us traveling day and night. It was probably just too much for her to handle. With the time it took to nurse her back to health, I didn't make it back to Fittoa region for a good 2 months. It took so long, I almost wish we'd have taken a carriage from the start. I'd long failed the delivery job, of course, but the breach of contract fee wasn't too painful. At the moment, though, I was in the depths of despair. We hadn't reached Buena Village yet, but I'd finally discovered just how gray the situation really was. Everything in the Fittoa region had vanished. I was bewildered, totally bewildered. What the hell had happened? Where was Zenith and Lilia? The citadel of Roa had disappeared too. Did that mean that even Rudeus was gone? This can't be happening. At some point, I'd fallen on my knees in shock and anguish. The words, "they were wiped out by teleportation trap," echoed in my mind. It was a phrase I'd heard more than once back in my adventuring days, when I was still exploring labyrinths. Teleportation trap was one thing that you had to watch out for. They split your party up and left you uncertain of your own location. Triggering one was a very bad idea. I heard numerous stories of veteran teams that were totally wiped out as a result of those things. Once, I had seen a stunned man recounting how his whole party has stepped on a teleportation circle. He managed to team up with another adventurer and fight his way out of the labyrinth, only to discover that his friends had perished. But what happened here? To us. Daddy, aren't we going home yet? Norn's voice snapped me back into reality, her small hand clutching my sleeve. Without saying a word, I hugged her close. What's wrong, Daddy? That's right. I'm her dad. The girl still doesn't understand what happened, but she wasn't worried because she had me with her. I was her father. I was her father now. Damn it. I couldn't show any weakness. I had to stay calm and confident. Everything was going to be all right. Teleportation was a dangerous trap. I didn't have any idea how this happened, but I was alive, wasn't I? Zenith was a former adventurer in her own right, and although Lilia wasn't as nimble as she used to be due to her being poisoned, she still knew how to use a sword. Aisha, though, think, damn it. Was Lilia touching her at that moment? I couldn't remember, but I wasn't going to give up hope either. For now, I just have to believe that Lilia was holding her daughter's hand when the light hit us. I returned the guild's horse to the nearest town and began gathering information. It seemed like this magical calamity had really affected the entire Fittoa region. Philip and Saros were both missing, so Philip's older brother was currently serving as acting lord. However, he was under intense political pressure to take responsibility for the disaster. From the sound of things, he was on the verge of being stripped of his position. All the man's energy was currently devoted to protecting himself, so he hadn't taken any real steps to deal with the calamity itself. Instead of looking out for his people, the selfish bastard was trying to save his own skin, and you wonder why I couldn't stand Osran nobles. In the course of my investigations, I met with an old man named Alphonse. He introduced himself as a butler who had been in Philip's service prior to the disaster. His loyalty to the Boreas family was apparently unshaken despite his current circumstances. He was setting up a refugee camp, paid it out of his own pocket, and he wanted to get some help to get it off the ground. When I asked him why he wanted me, the old man explained that Philip had sometimes mentioned my name. Apparently, he had me pinned as a man who shows his real worth in a crisis, but also tends to create them through his own short-sightedness. I wasn't really asking for a critique. Whatever. Alphonse admitted that he was somewhat hesitant to approach me on the basis of this questionable endorsement. Once he took the fact that I was Rudeus' father into consideration, however, he decided that it would be wise to seek my help. I'd heard about how things were going in Roa through letters, but it was still nice to see my son was thought of so highly by someone he probably hadn't even interacted with that often. In any case, I accepted Alphonse's offer gladly and got to work right away. After a month, we had made plenty of progress. Alphonse was a man of many connections. In only a few short weeks, he had somehow dealt with all the preparations and gathered enough workers to get the refugee camp up and running. It was seriously an impressive feat. For my part, I recruited most of the young refugees who'd gathered in the area into an organization called the Fittoa Search and Rescue Squad. We traveled all around the country, helping out people who had been displaced by the calamity. Of course, my primary objective wasn't to save a bunch of total strangers. First and foremost, I was looking for my family. At this point, the power struggles in the royal capital apparently resolved itself. Since Alphonse began to receive disaster recovery funds from the government, I left a note behind at the refugee camp for Rudeus and set out with my squad to the holy country of Millis, home to the headquarters of the Adventurers Guild. Osra and Millis were two of the biggest countries in the world. I figured the information I was looking for had to be in one or the other. It felt like a logical approach. Honestly, I thought I'd find everyone soon enough. Talk about blind optimism. My first 6 months in Millis were productive enough. As it turned out, a large number of Fittoans had been teleported to this continent, and we went around rescuing every last one of them. Some had already been sold off as slaves, and forcefully liberating someone else's property was against the law in Millis. But the thought of someone selling Zenith or Lilia into slavery made me so furious that I never hesitated to break the law. I stuck stubbornly to a policy of rescuing everyone we found. Once I decided for that course of action, I turned to Zenith's family for help. As it happens, my wife came from a noble house with some real power in Millis. They were well known for producing many famous knights, among other things. With their assistance, I started to lay the groundwork for freeing all the slaves we located. All in all, our efforts went smoothly. We moved fast and found many of the stranded, penniless Fittoans quickly. Once we extracted them from whatever predicament they landed in, we provided those capable of heading back home themselves with traveling funds, recruited any willing volunteers into our squad, and found places for children and elderly refugees to stay. Freeing the slaves took more effort, of course. We paid for their freedom where we could. When there wasn't an option, we had Zenith's family put pressure on them. And when that didn't work, we looked for chances to snatch them from their owners. Naturally, forcefully snatching away slaves didn't endear us to the Millis nobility as a whole. Some of them even sent personal forces after us. We had our number of fatalities. Still, I wasn't about to stop. I had the moral high ground here. I was saving desperate people who needed help. And for that reason, my squad stuck with me, despite the anger. I used everything I had, the Greyrat name, my connection with Zenith's family, and the reputation as a former adventurer, to find ways around obstacles in our path. But no matter how hard we worked, no matter how thoroughly I searched, I couldn't seem to get any information on Zenith or Lilia. Hell, I haven't even heard anything about Rudeus yet. The boy stood out like a sore thumb everywhere he went. But now, it felt like he'd fallen off the face of the planet. Before I knew it, an entire year had slipped by. By this point, we were hearing about fewer and fewer stranded Fittoans. We probably found most of everyone we were going to find in both Millis continent and the southern region of the central continent. There were still some smaller villages we hadn't searched yet, and a number of slaves that we hadn't managed to free, but that was about it. My squad was working systematically to liberate the remaining slaves. Once we got our hands on them, the rest was simple enough. I knew it was a violent approach. I knew that every slave we liberated earned me more hatred from the local nobility. I did it anyways. Sometimes that got my people attacked on the streets. Sometimes they were badly injured or even killed. And some members of the squad blame me for that. Maybe they were right. Maybe I could have prevented things from taking such an ugly turn. But no matter what anyone said, I wasn't going to change my approach now. I was too committed to the path I had chosen. We started getting more news about dead Fittoans than live ones. There had been more bad news than good news from the start, but the ratio just kept getting worse. To be frank, the people I found alive were very much in the minority. Dietos, Chloe, Laws, Bonnie, Lane, Marion, Monty. All of them were gone now. Every time I learned about another dead acquaintance, my blood ran ice cold. Sometimes a member of my squad would break down in tears at the latest piece of awful news. More than once, we arrived just a little too late to save someone, and a friend or family member would take their anger out on me, demanding to know why I'd taken so long to get us to that one village or town. There was a risk that we'd get ourselves stranded somewhere if we didn't plan out our movements carefully, though, so I didn't want to think my strategy was wrong. Under my leadership, we'd managed to save several thousand refugees. Of course, if I had managed to get a hold of my old party members, the Black Wolf Fangs, they could search the Demon Continent and the Beggar Continent for us as well. But I only managed to get in touch with one of them, and he'd vanished shortly after a few brief conversations. I had no idea what he was doing now. I wouldn't call him heartless or anything. We'd never gotten along very well in the first place, and there had been one hell of a fight when I left. After the way I said goodbye, it would be hardly surprising if they still didn't resent me. Why the hell did I have to leave things on such a sour note anyways? I was such a stupid kid, but there wasn't much point dwelling on that now. A year and a half had passed since the displacement incident. These days, alcohol had been the only thing that kept me going. I started to drink in the morning and kept going right into the night. I was literally never sober. I know I should stop myself, but whenever the booze wore off, the exact same thoughts always popped in my head. I'd tell myself my family was dead. I would think about ways in which they might have died. I'd wonder what happened to their corpses. I couldn't think about anything else. Can you really blame me? Even that absurdly talented son of mine had vanished without a trace. I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. But in all probability, he was dead. They had all probably died sometime in the last 8 months, with tears running down their faces, waiting for me to rescue them. Every time I pictured it, I thought I might go crazy. What the hell was I doing here anyways? Why had I wasted all this time helping a bunch of strangers? I should have been heading straight to the most dangerous parts of the world from the very start. I could have managed, somehow, even if it was on my own. I made the wrong choice, and now I'd lost my family. The people I cared about most had been stolen from me, and I could never get them back. I didn't want to believe that, of course, so I drank. When I was drunk, at least, I could feel something like happiness. I wasn't doing much real work anymore. In another 6 months, we'd be starting an operation to so many of the Fittoans we'd found in the Millis continent back home. These were old people, women, children, and people so sick they could barely move. Even if we gave them money, there was no guarantee they would endure the long journey, but they all wanted to return to their homeland. And so my squad would be escorting them all the way back to the kingdom of Asura. The planning was moving forward steadily, but despite my role as a captain of the squad, I skipped out on the meetings and spent my days drinking. I would be remaining in Millis after the operation, along with a few other key members of the search and rescue squad. Once it was complete, however, our activities would be scaled down sharply. In other words, they were going to cut off the search for victims after only 2 years. It felt much too early. I had to admit I understood their logic. Continuing to comb this countryside would just be a waste of money at this point. In the end, I hadn't managed to find a single member of my family. I was such a failure. Now that I was plastered all the time, the other members of the squad started to keep their distance from me. I could hardly blame them. Nobody wants to waste their time dealing with some drunken moron. There were a few exceptions though, and Norn was one of them. Daddy, guess what? Guess what happened when I was outside? No matter how drunk I might be, Norn would always chatter happily at me. The sweet little kid was all I had left of my family now. Right, there was a good reason I hadn't gone to the Demon Continent, or Beggaret wasn't there. I had Norn to take care of. What was I supposed to do? Abandon my 4-year-old daughter? There was no way I could have left her behind and wandered off somewhere I might easily die. What's up, Norn? Did something good happen? Yeah, I almost fell down in the street, and this big bald guy helped me out. And then he gave me this. Look. With a big smile, Norn showed me a bright red apple in her hands. It sure looked fresh and juicy. Oh yeah? Well, look at you. Did you say thank you like a good girl? Yeah. When I said thanks, the Baldy patted me on the head. No kidding. I guess you ran into a real nice person. But you shouldn't call him Baldy, okay? Some guys are sensitive to that kind of thing. Chatting with my daughter was always so fun. Norn was the light of my life. If anyone tried to harm her, I'd end them, even if it meant picking a fight with the Pope of the Millis Church. This is the point in which Paul would be reunited with Rudeus. However, due to Rudeus' cheerful nature in telling his adventures, Paul would become enraged. He felt that while he was suffering and looking for his family, Rudeus hadn't done anything. It was also the fact that he'd never seen his message that he left with the Adventure Guild. They would have a fight, and Rudeus would leave. This is the point in which Geese would step in and talk some sense into Paul. The conversation was filled with Paul's frustration over his genius son not having helped at all. While he was happy that Rudeus was alive, he couldn't shake the expectation that he had. Geese would stamp all this out by pointing out the age of his son, how his feats for surviving the dangerous demon continent was no easy task. He even claims that Paul would have never made it out alive at his age. The question that seemed to hit him hardest was the following. Look, Paul, let me just repeat myself here. You expect way too much from your son. Tell me something. Why can't you just be happy that he made it here? Does it even really matter what kind of trip the kid had? Let's say it really was a carefree cruise, and he spent every minute of it making out with his little girlfriend. So what? He's here now, and he's safe. Ain't that something worth celebrating? Would you have preferred that your son came back hollowed eyes, down on a limb or two? Hell, there was a damn good chance of you reuniting with a corpse. Oh wait, my mistake. If he had died on the Demon Continent, there wouldn't even be a body left for you to find. Paul realized at this point that just a few days prior, he had imagined this same scenario, and it haunted him. To add to it, Geese informed him that Rudeus was captured by the Dolia tribe. That meant that he was likely that he never seen Paul's message at the guild. All this snapped Paul out of it, and he wanted to reconcile with his son. Afterwards, Paul would return to his room at the inn. He found Norn already asleep. I poured myself a cup of water from the pitcher on the table and quickly drank the whole thing. I could feel myself gradually sobering up. I'd always had a high tolerance to alcohol. I did get plastered when I drank a lot, but the effects never seemed to last long. As the fog in my head slowly began to clear, I looked down at my daughter, who was curled up in the bed, clutching her blanket, and I stroked her gently on the head. I felt sorry for Norn. I really did. With a father like me, she had to have plenty of complaints, but she always kept them to herself and tried her very best to smile. If I ever lost her, I wouldn't have the strength to go on living. Norn shifted in her bed and mumbled. It didn't seem like I'd woken her up. She was probably just sleep-talking. Norn wasn't like Rudy. She was an ordinary child. I had to keep her safe. Suddenly, an odd thought occurred to me. If Rudy had been an ordinary kid as well, would he be sleeping in this room with Norn right now? He would have stayed home with us instead of going off to be a tutor. And at the moment of the disaster, he might have been tugging on my sleeve, asking if he could hug Norn too. If Rudy had been ordinary, a normal 11-year-old, wouldn't I look at him the same way that I looked at Norn, as someone I needed to protect? My legs trembled underneath me. I finally understood what Geese had told me. He's still a kid. What difference did it make that Rudy was ordinary or not? How did that even matter? What if Norn had been a genius? Would I have spoken to her like that? If Norn had come back to me after a long adventure, knowing nothing about what had taken place, would I have told her I expected more? Once I started thinking about that, I couldn't fall asleep. I didn't even want to lay down in bed. I left our inn, found a fire bucket full of water outside, and dumped the whole jug over my head. And then remembering the look on Reese's face as he left the bar, I bent over and vomited. Refresh my memory, Paul. Who was it that hurt the kid that badly? Looking down into the fire bucket, I saw the face of a total idiot. Whoever this dumbass is, he was obviously the last man in the world who had any business calling himself a father. This might be tough. If I was in the kid's shoes, I'd cut ties without a second thought. After this, Paul would go and reconcile with Rudeus. Now, most of that is from Rudeus' perspective, but the part that really kind of sticks out to me, which was pretty brilliantly covered in the anime, that I still want to kind of cover here, just to kind of give this some closure, was the moment that the barkeep walks up and sets down a drink in front of Rudeus. He told him, at least look the guy in the face. It was only when I heard those words that it hit me. I'd been avoiding Paul's gaze this entire time. Averting my eyes when he walked in, I hadn't even looked him in the face again. Not even once. Swallowing anxiety, I looked up at my father. His face was full of uncertainty and angst. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking in tears. Why are you making that face? What face? Paul said, smiling weakly. With his listless expression and hollow cheeks, he looked like a completely different person from the man I'd known before. But for some reason, I felt like I'd seen a very similar face sometime before. Where was it? I had a feeling it was a long time ago. Now I remembered. I'd seen that in the bathroom mirror back in my old house. This would have been a year or two after I became a total shut-in. At that point, I still thought I had time to turn things around. But I was also aware of the growing gap between me and everyone I knew. One that I might never be able to bridge. Still, I was simply too afraid to go outside again. And so, feelings of anxiety and frustration steadily built up inside of me. It was probably the single most emotionally volatile period of my life. I see. So that's how it is. Paul was searching desperately for his family with no success. For all his efforts, he hadn't found a single scrap of news for ages. He was worried about us constantly, and eventually, he started to ask himself, what if they got hurt? What if they fell ill? What if they were already dead? The more he thought about it, the more worried he grew. And then, at long last, I showed up with a cheerful smile on my face. It was so very different from what Paul imagined that he grew irritated despite himself. I'd once experienced something similar. Not long after I began my life as a loser, somebody I knew from my junior high stopped by to visit and started telling me about what was going on in school. I was deeply depressed and in so much pain. But he talked about his life like he didn't have a single care in the world. It made my stomach hurt. I ended up snapping and hurling harsh insults at him. The day after that, I told myself that I'd apologize to him the next time he dropped by, but he never came over again, and I didn't reach out to him either. I let some sort of stubborn pride hold me back. I remember now, that was exactly when I'd seen that face in the mirror. I've got a proposal, Father. What? In these circumstances, I feel like we should try to act like grown-ups. Yeah, I guess I wasn't too mature yesterday. I'm not sure what you're getting at, though. The gloom inside of my heart was melting rapidly away. I finally understood how Paul felt. Once I had that piece of the puzzle, the rest was simple enough, really. I thought back to the past again. The day that Paul chewed me out for fighting, and I'd fire back sharp words of my own. At the time, I'd been less impressed by his parenting skills, but he was only 24 then, very young for a father, so I decided not to judge him too harshly. It had been 6 years since then. Paul was now 30 years old. He was still younger than my previous self, and he'd already accomplished more than I'd ever had. When I'd fought with my friend, I didn't even try to patch things up. I just found ways to convince myself that it was his fault. By comparison, Paul was making so much effort. I wasn't the same person I was back then. I'd sworn to myself that I was going to change, hadn't I? I'd forgotten about that completely, but I couldn't let myself repeat the same stupid mistakes over and over again. This is a much bigger fight than our last one, yes. But I was behaving the exact same way that I did 6 years ago. We were both making stupid mistakes all over again. I thought that I'd come a long way since then, but instead, it seemed that I'd been treading water. I had to acknowledge that. And more importantly, I had to take a real step forward. Let's pretend yesterday never happened. It was a simple enough proposition. I was deeply hurt by what Paul said to me at that bar. The pain had been almost unendurable. My friend, who stopped by out of concern for me, must have felt something similar when I pushed him away. And that was how things ended. We never saw each other again. It wasn't going to turn out that way this time. I wouldn't let my bond with Paul be broken. The two of us didn't have a fight yesterday. Right now, in this moment, we're seeing each other again for the first time in years. Got it? What are you talking about, Rudy? Don't overthink it, please. Just spread your arms open wide. Go on. Okay. Paul spread his arms, looking a little dubious. I promptly threw myself into him. Father, I've missed you so much. His body smelt faintly of alcohol. He seemed to be sober now, but I wouldn't have been surprised that he was still nursing a hangover. When had he started drinking so heavily anyways? I felt like he barely touched that stuff back in the day. Rudy? Paul didn't seem to know how to react. Resting my chin on his shoulder, I slowly murmured a little advice. Come on, you've just been reunited with your son. Isn't there anything you want to say? This was all a bit ridiculous, yes. But even so, I hugged Paul's solidly built body with all my might. It wasn't just his face that had gotten thinner. It felt like his body was a size or two smaller than it was before. Of course, I've done some growing myself over the years, so that probably had something to do with it. But it was obvious that my father had been through a lot in these very hard times. After a moment's hesitation, Paul managed to mumble, I missed you too. And once he got those first words out, it was as if the floodgates opened. I miss you so damn much. I searched and searched, but I couldn't find anybody. I started to think you might be dead. I started picturing you. When I looked up at Paul again, tears were streaming down his cheeks. It wasn't exactly a pretty picture. The man was sobbing like a baby. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Rudy. Well, great. Now he's got me going too. I patted the back of Paul's head a few times. For a while, the two of us just cried together. And so, for the first time in 5 years, I was finally reunited with my father. This stuff is so good. It gets me every time. It is so good. I absolutely love this story. It just like I said before, I cried my eyes out with the anime. It was just so emotional. But it's kind of one of those things where you see the montage and you can kind of fill in the gaps of what Paul's going through. Obviously, he's torn up. You see how low he is. You make the assumptions. He's in a bad state. But I like that kind of, unfortunately, slow descent into just pure depression that it goes into, and having that build up. And like I said, I wanted to include this little segment with Rudeus because he sort of feels in that later part of it, oh, this is just like me where I messed up and I wanted to fix it, but I never did. And that's what Paul's doing right now. He's wanting to fix this problem that he's created, and I can give him that option. I just need to open that door for him. He's like me when I was back here, and I never walked through that door, so I need to pull him through it. I need to give him that opportunity. But additionally, he's also acknowledging the idea that Paul's doing a lot more than I did. If I was Paul in this situation, I'd still be back at my house looking at the mirror and wondering if I can ever fix the situation. It's such good stuff. I absolutely love this whole segment, and it's gonna tear me up going to get screenshots for this video because it hurts me every single time. But I hope you guys enjoy this little skip content for Paul Greyrat in the Millis continent. But I hope you guys enjoy this video. As always, if you did, make sure that like button down below, comment, let me know what you think of this whole segment. Additionally, if you're new to the channel, make sure that subscribe button's got my content. I do news, reviews, first impressions, top list. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. Additionally, if you want to support the channel more, you like this content, I have a Patreon link, tips link, super links, membership button down below. Greatly appreciate what it does, and y'all take care.